Hello and welcome. The story we are exploring tonight is based on a terrifying local legend from Japan, one grounded in true wartime tragedy. We are taking you to a specific location, an abandoned textile mill in Aichi. Most nights, it's just the smell of oil, dust, and the creak of old doors. But there is one disturbing detail that makes this place infamous. They say that when the midnight bell rings, the looms and spindles start again, all by themselves, attempting to finish a shift that was never completed. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens. We will explain exactly who, or what, is still working. Leah Martin knew two things with absolute certainty. Rent was due in 3 days, and the last instant noodle cup in her cupboard tasted like savoury cardboard. This was the foundation of her reality, a dull, aching pressure that made her scroll past job listings for entry-level marketing associate, requires 5 years experience, and dynamic barista, must be available 24/7 with a hollow feeling in her chest. Then the email had come. Kuroha Textile Mill, night shift monitor, immediate start. The interview, if one could call it that, had been a 3-minute phone call with a tired-sounding man. He hadn't asked about her experience, her university degree, half-finished, perpetually deferred, or her references. He had simply stated the hourly wage, a number that made Leah's breath hitch, and asked, "Can you start Monday?" Leah, staring at the red-bordered eviction notice tucked into her apartment doorframe, had said yes before her brain had fully processed the question, and so here she was, Monday. The 10:45 p.m. bus was the last of its line, and it had grown to a halt at a lonely stop marked by nothing but a leaning pole. The driver, a woman with kind eyes and a weary face, had watched her step off. Kuroha Mill, that's it, up the path. Be careful, hun, that place. It's been there a long time. The path was less a path and more a suggestion, swallowed by overgrown fields on either side. Weeds, waist-high and silvered by a weak moon, brushed against her thin jacket, leaving damp trails. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and something metallic, a low rusted fence, its wires curling like dead vines, sagged between cracked concrete posts, marking the boundary of the mill's property. It was a feeble attempt at security. In most places, the weeds had simply pulled it down. Leah pulled her jacket tighter. This was the simple purpose in action. It was just a job, a slightly strange, remote job, but a job nonetheless. The wage would cover rent, groceries, and maybe, just maybe, the next payment on her student loan. This was what normal people did. They worked. They endured boring, slightly unpleasant environments for 8 hours, and then they went home. The mill itself loomed out of the darkness, a colossal brick and steel shadow against the bruised purple sky. It was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings from different eras. The main building, however, was clearly the oldest. Its massive, dust-clouded windows were opaque, reflecting the moon as a series of milky, sightless eyes. As she approached, the relatable environment felt less relatable and more like something from an old, forgotten photograph. The main gate was a different beast from the sagging perimeter fence. It was a 10-foot-tall barrier of heavy iron, its bars thick as a man's arm. The stylized kanji for Kuroha Textile Mill were welded above it, though the ha, Z, had rusted through and fallen away, leaving only Kuro, the word for black. A small, brightly lit security shed sat beside the gate, an absurdly modern pimple on the face of the ancient structure. A man stepped out, a cloud of cigarette smoke preceding him. Leah Martin. His voice was the same gravelly and tired tone from the phone. He was older, maybe 50, with a deep-lined face and a greying uniform that hung loosely on his frame. "Yes, Mr. Cole? Just Cole," he grunted. Not unkindly, he unlocked a heavy padlock on the gate, and it swung open with a piercing, metallic shriek that echoed off the brick facade. "Night shift's just you. I'm the day manager, Just staying to get you settled. Leah stepped through. This was it, the start of her new, normal life. Cole led her not to the main entrance, but to a smaller steel door set into the side of the building. As he fumbled with another set of keys, the wind picked up, howling through the bars of the iron gate behind them. It wasn't a normal whistle. It was a reedy, fluting sound, like someone blowing over the top of a glass bottle, and it seemed to vibrate in Leah's teeth. "Don't mind the noise," Cole said, finally wrenching the door open. "This place is ancient. The machines are old, the building's old, the wind's old. Don't worry about it." He flicked a switch, and a row of sickly yellow lights flickered to life inside. The first thing that hit Leah wasn't the sight. It was the smell. It was a burnt smell, but not like wood smoke or a recent fire. It was the scent of after a fire, decades later. A memory that had been scrubbed and painted over but had refused to leave. It was the smell of superheated oil, charred fibres, and something uniquely, sourly metallic. It was a muiketlo num, a scent of old scorch, and it seemed to be physically ingrained in the plaster of the walls, like a permanent stain. It clung to the air, thick and heavy. "Place had a small fire in the 70s, Cole said, noticing her slight wince. "The West Wing. We don't use it anymore. You get used to the smell." Leah nodded, forcing a smile. "It's fine. Just strong. Your job is simple," Cole continued, leading her down a long, narrow hallway. The walls were a peeling industrial green, the concrete floor cracked and uneven. "This is the main artery. Leads to the loom floor. You walk the floor once an hour. Make sure the automatic looms are running. There's a punch clock in the main hall. Punch it every hour. That's it. Don't touch anything. Don't try to fix anything. If a machine stops, you write it in the log. We'll handle it in the morning." That's all. That's all. Cole stopped at the end of the hall, before a set of double doors. "Easy money, right?" He sounded like he was trying to convince himself. 2. "Any questions?" Leah looked back down the long passage. Her footsteps, she realized, were obscenely loud on the concrete, a sharp clack, clack, clack that seemed to hang in the air for a second too long before being swallowed by the oppressive quiet. A faded safety poster was tacked to the wall, the cartoon face of a smiling bobbin winking above the words, "A safe loom is a happy loom." The bottom corner of the poster was cupped, peeling away from the wall, and it flapped gently, rhythmically, in a draft that Leah couldn't feel. Flap, flap, flap. "No," Leah said, her voice sounding small. "No questions." "Good. I'm out of here." Cole handed her a key. "This is for the break room. Coffee machines probably from the same era as the fire. But it works. Lock the main door behind you when you leave at 7. Don't let anyone in." He turned and walked away, his own footsteps receding down the hall, leaving Leah alone in the buzzing, scented silence. She watched him go, a knot tightening in her stomach. This was the moment, the "this could happen to me" moment. A person, needing a job, takes a slightly sketchy one in a rundown building. It was the setup for 1,000 mundane lives. There was nothing to be afraid of. Leah took a deep breath, the smell of burnt cloth and hot metal filling her lungs. She pushed open the double doors. The loom floor was vast. It was a cavernous space, the size of an airplane hangar, disappearing into a darkness that the high bay lights couldn't fully penetrate. The only illumination came from functional work lamps hanging over the active machines, creating islands of harsh light in a sea of shadow. And the sound, it was a metallic buzz, a constant, high-pitched thrum that was less a noise and more a physical vibration. It was the collective hum of dozens of automated looms, their mechanical arms flying back and forth in a frantic, clattering rhythm. Clack, 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 whir, clack, clack. Leah walked onto the designated metal gangway, her footsteps now lost in the industrial din. She passed the active machines, their lights harsh, their movements hypnotic. But the active section was only a small part of the room. To her left, stretching into the gloom, was the old section. Here, the machines were silent. They were different models, older, heavier, built from black iron and dark, polished wood, and every single one of them was draped in a heavy, off-white canvas sheet. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, a forest of shrouded figures. Leah paused, her hand gripping the cold metal railing. The light from the active section barely touched them, just enough to silhouette their strange, hunched shapes. And the sheets, they looked almost human. They didn't just cover the looms, they clung to them, draped over gears and levers in a way that suggested shoulders, a head, a seated form. They looked like figures huddled over their work, frozen in place, and then hastily covered before they could look up. A draft, far colder than the one in the hallway, slithered through the vast room. It was a cold breath that seemed to originate from the dark, silent end of the floor. The sheets stirred. Leah's heart leapt into her throat. It wasn't a uniform flapping. It was a slow, staggered movement. One sheet in the third row lifted at the corner, held for a beat, and settled. Then another, further back, seemed to inflate. A gentle, rhythmic fap-fong, a rise and a fall. It looked exactly like breathing. Leah stood frozen, her mind screaming it out. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a draft. This was wrong. But then, the formula of her life reasserted itself. Rent, noodles, the eviction notice, the wage. Don't worry about it, McCall's voice. The machines are old. She forced a laugh, but it came out as a strangled gasp. It's just the wind. Leah, it's an old building. Nyaku Kuting Noi Ring. Old houses have their own voices. Her mother used to say that about their creaking apartment. This is just a very big, very old house. The air was pushing up from the floor vents. Probably, that's what it was. The shapes were just machines. The human-like form was a coincidence, a trick of the light and the shrouds. The breathing was just air currents. This was her job, her simple, boring, normal job. She was an ordinary person, and this was a relatable, if slightly creepy, environment. She would not be scared off by a flapping sheet. Leah looked at her cheap plastic watch. 11:15 p.m. She had 45 minutes until she had to punch the clock, taking another ragged breath that tasted of ash. She turned away from the silent, breathing looms. She began her first round, her eyes fixed determinedly on the active, clattering, brightly lit machines. Behind her, in the vast, cold darkness, a dozen canvas sheets rose and fell in a slow, patient, and perfectly synchronized rhythm. Midnight in the loom hall of the Morita Textiles mill was not a true silence. It was a vacuum, a pressurized absence of the day's violent industry. Leah felt the quiet as a physical weight on her ears, a low-frequency pressure that seemed to push the dust motes down from the rafters and onto the sleeping giants of cast iron and steel. She was a systems engineer, a woman of logic and diagnostics. She believed in schematics, in cause and effect, in the predictable and reassuring flow of electrons through a circuit. The factory, even this ancient, storied half-museum, was just a large, complex system. And systems, no matter how old, followed rules. Her boots echoed on the worn concrete floor, the sound seeming too loud, almost irreverent. Her checklist was digital, glowing softly on her tablet. A small island of 21st century order in a sea of 20th century ghosts. This was her third night shift, the first she'd been allowed to run solo after Martin, the impossibly old night guard, had shuffled off on his own rounds. Satisfied she wouldn't accidentally burn the place down, she was checking the junction boxes for the dormant looms, ensuring the new sensor network she'd installed was properly interfacing with the old wiring. It was mundane work. It was supposed to be. That's when the first small, unsettling detail occurred. The overhead fluorescent grid, a network of long, buzzing tubes, gave a single, violent flicker. It wasn't a brownout, not a gentle dip, but a sharp, digital off-on. A blink so fast it felt malicious. The flicker plunged the hall into absolute, primordial blackness for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, the pressurized silence of the room was punctured by a sound. It was a sharp click, like a heavy-duty magnetic relay engaging. Leah flinched, her hand tightening on her flashlight. F04 breaker, she murmured. A purely rational diagnosis. The wiring in this wing was pre-war. Such flickers were an expected anomaly. She made a note on her tablet to check the main panel tomorrow. The building was old. Old buildings had quirks. It was a simple, logical explanation that settled her pulse almost immediately. But the sound had not come from the breaker panel behind her. It had come from the center of the room, from the darkness where the largest loom sat. And the flicker hadn't felt like a failure of power. It felt like a surge, like a switch being thrown not by a fault, but by a hand. It was the sound of an invitation being accepted. Leah continued her walk, shining her flashlight beam down the long canyon of dormant machines. The beam was a solid cone of white in the hazy air, cutting through a fog of suspended cotton fibers and dust. It was almost beautiful, like a searchlight in a cathedral. She stopped at the junction box for Loom 7, the behemoth that had been the pride of the factory in the 50s. Its panel was cold. She ran her diagnostic, the tablet humming faintly. All systems nominal, all systems asleep. She was about to move on when a pinprick of light appeared in her peripheral vision. On the control console of Loom 7, a single red indicator light glowed to life. It was a small, domed bulb, the kind meant to signal a fault. It didn't flicker. It pulsed, a slow, steady beat. Throb, throb, throb. Leah frowned. This was impossible. The machine was in a cold shutdown state. The only power it should be drawing was a microvoltage for the new sensors, certainly not enough to light an old-world incandescent fault bulb. Residual charge, she muttered, tapping the glass cover of the light. Or a short. The new sensors must be crossing a wire somewhere, she sighed. That meant pulling the entire conduit tomorrow. It was annoying. A problem to be solved. Nothing more. A ghost in the machine, but a literal one. A phantom voltage. A simple electrical gremlin. As she stared, a second red light, 3 feet down the console, pulsed to life. Then a third, on the loom opposite. Then another, and another, in a scattered, cascading sequence down the entire length of the hall. One by one, red indicators on machines that were supposedly inert woke up, not in a chaotic cascade of electrical failure, but in a slow, deliberate progression, like eyes opening one after another in the dark. A system-wide failure would have been simultaneous. This was a relay race. This was a signal passing from one sleeping mind to the next. This was not a short. It was a roll call. Leah's breath hitched. She was no longer an engineer diagnosing a fault. She was a trespasser. The air suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. She forced a laugh, but it came out as a sharp puff of air. Okay, that's weird. Martin must have been testing the emergency power grid. It was a flimsy rationalization. Martin didn't have the authorization. And this wasn't the behavior of an emergency test. But it was an explanation, and right now, any explanation was a shield against the rising, illogical dread that was prickling at the base of her neck. She would find Martin. She would ask him. This was a test. It had to be. She turned to walk back toward the security station, but the sound stopped her. It wasn't the loud, industrial clack, clack, clack of production. It was a subterranean sound, a low-frequency hum that she felt more in her teeth than heard with her ears. It was the sound of 1,000 tons of iron thinking about moving, and woven into this hum, like a thread in a tapestry, was a new, specific rhythm. Click, shh, click, click, shh, click. It was a complex, weaving cadence, like a dozen telegraph keys being operated by delicate, precise hands. It was the sound of the Jacquard loom's punch card system, the click of the needle sensor, the shh of the card shifting. No, she whispered, her flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the silent, unmoving machines. No, you're off. You are all off. The sound was an acoustic illusion, the building's HVAC system kicking in, its vibrations rattling the old mechanisms. It was an echo of the day, a sonic ghost she'd read about in a pop science article. The mind plays tricks. In the dark, in the silence, the ear invents patterns. She was tired, that was all, but the sound was too clean, too precise. The shh wasn't the metallic sigh of a machine, it was sibilant, like a human whisper. The rhythm wasn't random, it was a language. Click, shh, click. It was slipping in and out of phase with her own heartbeat, a parasitic rhythm trying to take control. It was the sound of a question mark, an inquiry posed in a language of wood and steel. The machines were not built to make this sound. They were built for percussive violence. This sound was subtle, inquisitive, and infinitely more terrifying. It was the sound of something learning to speak, and the shh was the only vowel it knew. The whispers were not in the sound was the whispers. Leah felt a tremor of true panic. She had to get out. She had to find Martin. This wasn't a fault, it was a breakdown, her own. She was hallucinating. She backed away, her flashlight beam jittering. She stumbled and her hand fell against the polished chrome plating of Loom 7's main housing. It was cold, but it was also vibrating, a low, steady thrum that matched the click, shh, click rhythm perfectly. It was real. The sound was real. She stared at the chrome plate her hand was on, her own reflection looking back at her, pale, wide-eyed, her breath fogging the metal. Her flashlight beam, reflected off the chrome, cut a perfect bright circle in the dust haze beyond. And in that hazy, imperfect mirror, she saw it. For one heart-stopping, impossible second, there was a second face. It was not her own. It was a woman, standing just behind her left shoulder. So close Leah should have felt her breath. The face was pale, with dark, wet hair plastered to its cheeks, its eyes wide and empty, staring not at Leah, but through her, at the machine. Leah screamed, a short, choked sound, and spun around, flashlight held like a weapon. There was no one, nothing, just the long, empty aisle, the sleeping giants of iron, and the thick, dusty air. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. "I'm tired," she said, her voice shaking, trying to anchor herself. "I'm just tired." It was a reflection, a smudge on the chrome, a trick of the curved metal, her own face distorted by the weird light and the dust. It was a classic optical illusion, a double created by the complex angles. It had to be. She refused to believe anything else. She was an engineer. She did not believe in ghosts. But the image had been too clear. It had not been a distortion. It had been an imposition. The woman hadn't looked like her. The woman had looked like she belonged there, and Leah was the one who was out of place. The reflection wasn't a trick of the light. It was a glimpse into a space that coexisted with her own, a space where someone was still at their post. A mirror shows you what is. The factory was beginning to show her what always is. The past is not dead. In this place, it wasn't even past. It was a running program. And she was the new variable. Leah didn't walk. She ran. Her boots slammed on the concrete, the sound a frantic, desperate counter-rhythm to the click. Shh. Click that now seemed to follow her, echoing from all sides. The red lights pulsed in the dark behind her like the embers of a dying, or perhaps a waking, fire. She burst through the double doors into the brightly lit, blessedly modern security office. The sudden fluorescence made her blink, her shadows sharp and normal. Martin was exactly where she'd left him, sitting at his small desk, a cup of steaming green tea held in his wrinkled hands. He didn't look up as she stumbled in, breathless. He seemed to be listening to something, his head tilted, but the office was silent save for the buzz of the lights. He took a slow sip of his tea. The main hall, Leah panted, leaning against the doorframe. trying to make her voice sound casual, professional. The looms, the fault indicators are on, and there's a sound, a sort of clicking. Martin finished his sip. He did not look surprised. He did not look concerned. He looked, as he always did, impossibly tired. He placed his cup down with a soft click on the saucer. He finally turned his head, his eyes as dark and cloudy as an old photograph. "Ah," he said. His voice was a dry rustle, like old paper. He turned back to his tea. "Martin-san," Leah pressed, her fear giving way to frustration. "It's a system-wide. Something I saw. What, the machines are making noise." Martin picked up his cup again. He stared into the green liquid as if it held an answer. "Yes," he said. "They do that." "What? What do you mean?" "They do that. It's a malfunction. I need to report it." Martin looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than placid exhaustion in his face. It was a deep, profound pity. His gaze was not unkind, but it was the gaze of a man looking at someone who was about to walk a very long, very dark road. The worst fears are not the ones you invent in the dark. They are the ones that are quietly validated by the light. His calm was 1,000 times more terrifying than the reflection in the chrome. He gave his final, simple instruction. "Don't listen." He didn't say. "Don't worry about it." He didn't say. "I'll check it out." He said. "Don't listen." An admission that there was, indeed, something to hear, an order that was impossible to follow. The silence in the small office stretched, heavy and absolute, but Leah could still feel it, pulsing in the bones of her skull. The distant, steady, patient rhythm of the hall. Click, shh, click. The rain had not ceased. It had, in fact, settled in, transforming from a simple downpour into a permanent, suffocating presence. It hammered the corrugated tin roof of the Kanto textile mill with a relentless drumming roar that vibrated in Leah's bones. A sound so constant it had become a new form of silence. The air inside wasn't just damp. It felt pressurized, heavy, like the atmosphere in a diving bell descending into an abyss. Ozone, rust, and the metallic tang of old oil hung thick, clinging to the back of his throat. This was the start of his second night, and the fragile composure he had gathered during the daylight hours had already disintegrated. The factory, which by day was just a collection of dormant, greasy machines, had woken up. It was breathing around him. Strange events repeat. The unease from the first night returned, but it was no longer a vague premonition. It was a physical weight. The shadows in the corners of his vision seemed deeper, the peripheral flickers of movement more defined. The great, looming shapes of the looms on the main floor, which he had to pass to get to his assigned station, seemed to watch him, their iron bodies silhouetted against the rain-lashed windows. He was clocking in when Martin, the night shift foreman, and a man who looked as worn and frayed as the old transmission belts, grabbed his arm. Martin's grip was surprisingly strong, his skin dry and papery. "Leah," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the din of the rain and the hum of the auxiliary generators. He didn't make eye contact, instead staring at the flickering fluorescent panel above them. "Martin-san." A word of advice. Martin's eyes finally darted to his, and they were dark with a kind of resigned exhaustion. "Stick to your assigned area, lines 5 and 6. Check the tensioners. Watch the feeders. That's it." "Okay, I was planning to." Martin's grip tightened. "I mean it, kid. Don't go wandering. And whatever you do," he leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. "Stay away from line 3. Don't even walk past it if you can help it. The main floor is fine, but not that auxiliary wing. Got it?" The warning was so sudden, so specific, that it sent a chill colder than the rain down Leah's spine. "Line 3? Why? Is the machinery unstable? I heard it was decommissioned." "Decommissioned is one word for it," Martin muttered, releasing his arm. He seemed to regret saying anything at all. He shook his head, looking away. "Just Don't. It's not safe. Bad wiring. He walked away before Leah could ask another question. Bad wiring. It was the flimsiest, most transparent excuse he had ever heard. It wasn't a practical warning. It was a cryptic prohibition. A line drawn in the sand by a man who clearly knew more than he was willing to share. The foreman's words didn't reassure him. They isolated him. This wasn't a shared hazard, it was a personal warning, which meant the danger was personal, too. Intensity increases. Leah tried to shake it off, to focus on the mundane. He grabbed his toolkit and started his rounds on line 5. The work was simple, repetitive. Check a gauge, wipe a lens, tighten a bolt. But his mind was on line 3, and his route, unfortunately, required him to pass the corridor that led to it. Worse, his path took him past the door. It was a heavy, metal-plated service door to a storage closet, set in the concrete wall between the main floor and the dark corridor leading to the auxiliary wing. Unlike the other doors, this one was painted a fading, angry red, with the words, "Cam Vow, do not enter," stenciled on it in peeling black letters. It was a place no one ever went. As he approached, a sound snagged his attention, a faint metallic click. Click, click. He froze. The factory was loud, but this was different. It was small, sharp, and close. He stared at the door. The source of the sound was the old-fashioned brass doorknob. He watched, his breath held tight in his chest. As the knob began to turn, it moved with agonizing slowness, a fraction of an inch at a time. From the inside, a dry, scraping sound accompanied it, as if the mechanism were packed with sand. It turned perhaps 20 degrees, paused, and then slowly, just as slowly, turned back. Leah's blood ran cold. He was rooted to the spot. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't the building settling. That was a hand. Someone, or something, was on the other side of the locked door, methodically testing the handle. He should have run. He should have called for Martin. Instead, he found himself taking a step closer, drawn by a horrifying, morbid curiosity. He leaned in, his ear near the cold metal. He heard no footsteps, no voice, only a low, rhythmic thump, 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 thump. And then he felt it, a puff of air from the crack beneath the door, unnaturally cold and smelling of dust and something vaguely organic, like dried flowers or rot. The door itself seemed to move, a slight, barely perceptible warping of the thick metal panel, in and out, in time with the thumping. It was breathing. The door was breathing. He scrambled back, his toolkit clattering against his leg. He looked wildly around. At the far end of the factory floor, he could see Even, another night worker, headphones on, blissfully unaware as he calibrated a machine. He was completely, utterly alone with this. No one else notices or believes. He needed a specific wrench from the large community toolbox, which was, of course, resting on the floor right next to the breathing door. His mind screamed at him to leave it, to get Martin, to make do with what he had. But the fear of Martin's questions was, for a moment, stronger than the fear of the door. He was the new guy. He couldn't panic. He edged forward, his eyes locked on the handle. It was still. He crouched quickly, fumbling with the latch on the toolbox. His fingers were numb, clumsy. That's when he saw it. From the dark gap between the bottom of the door and the concrete floor, something was emerging. It wasn't a draft of cold air this time. It was a thread, a single, glistening black thread. It looked less like cotton and more like spun shadow, or a strand of liquid tar that somehow held its shape. It seeps into the factory light, moving with a slick, unnatural purpose. It wasn't being pushed by the air. It was crawling. He watched, paralyzed, as the sentient fibre slithered over the grimy floor. It bypassed a metal shaving and a dust bunny, moving with a horrifying, serpentine intelligence. It was a message from the dead, as the prompt had stated, and it was alive. It headed straight for him. It bowled and Muije Yuki. It crawled directly to the steel-toed cap of his work boot. The black tip touched the leather, and an intense, icy jolt shot up his leg. A static shock made of pure, necrotic cold. It wasn't electric. It was the cold of the grave. Leah yelled, a choked, strangled sound, and kicked his foot back. The instant he moved, the thread reacted. With the speed of a snapped whip, it jiak ngukvi, retracted. It shot back under the door in a blur, disappearing into the suffocating darkness of the forbidden closet. He fell backward, landing hard on the concrete. The toolbox spilled open, wrenches scattering with a series of loud clangs. "Leah, everything all right over there?" Ivan's voice, distant, tinny, called from across the floor. He had taken his headphones off. Leah gasped, pushing himself up on his elbows. His heart felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of his chest. Yeah, I just dropped the box. Slipped." Ivan squinted at him for a moment, shrugged, and put his headphones back on, turning back to his work. Leah was alone again. He scrambled to his feet, not bothering with the tools, and backed away from the door, his eyes wide with terror. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't the light. It was real. It had touched him. Intensity increases. He needed air. He needed to get away from that door. He stumbled, half running, toward the main corridor, his mind racing. Bad wiring. Stay away from line 3. He reached the end of his aisle and stopped, breathing in ragged gasps. He was at the junction. To his left was the main factory floor, Ivan, and relative sanity. To his right was the dark, echoing hallway that led to the auxiliary wing, to line 3. He knew he shouldn't look. Martin had warned him, but the warning, combined with the horror of the black thread, acted like a magnet. He had to see what he was being warned about. His gaze was pulled down the corridor. The perspective was exactly that of a slow dolly in. His vision narrowed, the noisy factory floor behind him fading away as his focus pushed deeper into the darkness of the auxiliary wing. The lights in that hallway were fewer, and one was flickering erratically, casting long, dancing shadows. At the very end of the hall, standing at the entrance to the decommissioned line 3, was a figure. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, almost blending into the shadows of the silent machinery. She was wearing an old factory uniform, a different style from their current ones, perhaps from decades ago, even from this distance, in the poor light. Leah could see a horrifying detail. The edges of her collar and the cuff of her visible sleeve were sem, scorched, blackened, as if she had been licked by flames. Leah's heart stopped. He was seeing her from an over-the-shoulder perspective, as if he were standing right behind himself. A detached observer watching the scene unfold. The figure didn't look at him. She didn't move. She just stood there, a static image of a long-past tragedy. Then, slowly, she raised her arm. Her hand was pale, her fingers long. She wasn't pointing at Leah. She wasn't waving him away. She was chitai vesan mai, pointing down at the concrete floor in front of the silent, dead machines of line 3. It was a warning, a desperate, silent, voiceless warning. She was telling him what to look for, or where the horror truly lay. As if her movement had triggered it, the flickering light above her buzzed violently, spat a shower of blue sparks and went out, plunging the end of the corridor into near-total darkness. Leah blinked, his eyes straining against the gloom. When his vision adjusted, she was gone. There was only an empty hallway, the smell of ozone from the dead light, and the relentless pounding drum of the rain on the roof. The events had repeated. The intensity had skyrocketed, and he was the only one who had seen a thing. The silence of the factory floor was a living thing. It was a heavy, felted blanket coated in machine oil and the iron scent of rust, muffling the world outside. Leah stood at the entrance to line 3, her small flashlight beam cutting a weak cone into the oppressive dark. This was wrong. She knew it. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to join the others in the rain-slicked parking lot, to go home. But the whispers had drawn her back. They had been clearer this time, pulling at her mind like a physical tether, leading her not just to the factory, but through it, to this specific, shadowed aisle, line 3, the oldest, shortest line, ending in a bricked-up wall where the original factory had been expanded. The air here was colder, stagnant. She took a hesitant step forward, the crunch of her boot on the gritty concrete sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. Lie, dung. The whisper was faint, a sigh of static from the darkness ahead. Who's there? Leah called out, her voice trembling. I'm not supposed to be here. We all have to. She was cut off, not by a voice, but by a sound. Screech. It was the sound of immense weight shifting on a dry, rusted axis. It was slow, agonizing, a groan of ancient metal and warped wood. Leah froze. Her flashlight beam snapped left. The first loom in line 1, a 30-ton behemoth of iron and timber, was moving. It wasn't vibrating. It wasn't rattling from a passing truck. It was turning, pivoting on its heavy, bolted base. It scraped across the concrete floor with a sound that set her teeth on edge. It moved a few inches, then a few more, its black, skeletal frame silhouetted against the grime-caked windows. Screek! Another one joined it, then a third. Leah staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth, down the long, cavernous central aisle, in the vast darkness punctuated only by the red glow of emergency exit signs. A legion of machines was coming to life, row after row. The looms, dormant for hours, began to turn. It was a synchronized, impossible ballet. They were not human-operated. The mechanisms were cold, the power grid silent. Yet they moved, like colossal, multi-legged insects. They twisted their bodies, their iron limbs groaning in a rising chorus of protest. The sound was deafening. A symphony of decay and impossible friction. One by one, they stopped. The scraping ceased, replaced by the heavy, expectant silence. Leah's flashlight beam trembled as she swept it across the floor. Her breath hitched. Every single loom in the factory, from line 1 to line 12, had turned. They were no longer facing forward in their neat, orderly rows. They were all aligned, perfectly. Every machine was now facing line 3. They were facing her. The factory floor had become a cathedral, and she was the sacrifice on the altar. The air crackled, thick with an energy that hummed against her skin. No, she whispered. No, this isn't real. I'm tired. I'm seeing things. But the new geometry of the room was undeniable. The perspective was warped, aggressive. The looms were a silent, waiting audience, an army, awaiting a command. And then the command came. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was a physical blow. Leah cried out, clapping her hands over her ears as the noise punched through the air, vibrating in her bones, in her teeth. The factory bell. It was impossible. She had seen the bell tower herself on her orientation tour. The foreman, Mr. Bass, had laughed and pointed up at it. 30 years. That thing's been silent, he'd said. Clap as a solid block of rust. Thing's more a statue than a bell. The sound that ripped through the factory was not the clear, resonant chime of a working bell. It was a shriek. It was the fractured, grating scream of rust tearing itself apart, of metal frozen for decades being forced, violently, back into service. It was a sound that had been dead and was now, agonizingly, alive. Clang, clang, clang. It rang with a frantic, desperate rhythm, faster and louder, echoing off the high steel rafters, a clangorous, all-encompassing din that hammered at her sanity. And as the last, painful echo died, fading into the humming silence, the other sound rose to take its place. The whispers. They were no longer faint. They were no longer in her head. They came from everywhere, from the throats of the looms, from the dust-choked vents, from the air itself, a dry, sibilant, overlapping chorus of voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once, Dungolai Sao Chung. Don't stay after the bell. Dungolai. Dungolai. The warning she had dismissed, the fragments she had pieced together. It was a prayer, a plea, and she had ignored it. The bell was not a signal to leave. It was a signal that it was too late. Thunk! With the finality of a guillotine, the main power grid failed. The dim, red exit signs vanished. The faint hum of the building's core systems died. Leah was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. She screamed, a thin, terrified sound that the darkness swallowed instantly. Her flashlight. She fumbled with the switch, her thumb slick with sweat. Nothing. Dead. The smell hit her then, the sharp tang of ozone, like lightning had struck the building, mixed with something else, something sweeter. The cloying, damp smell of cotton rotting on the bolt. B-Z-T-T-T. F. Flash. A single emergency light, 50 yards down the main aisle, flickered. It wasn't a light. It was a strobe. A dying, failing battery forcing a pulse of sickly, greenish-white light into the void. Flash. The factory floor was as she had seen it, empty, just rows upon rows of silent, watching looms, their iron skeletons stark in the brief, harsh light, darkness. A full second of total black. Leah's heart hammered against her ribs, a desperate bird in a cage. She tried to run. Her feet were lead. She was rooted to the concrete. Flash! They were there, at every loom, every single one. A figure seated on the operator's stool. Dozens of them. Scores of them. They were pale, their forms ghostly and indistinct in the strobe, like negatives of a photograph. They had not been there a second ago. Darkness. Leah's scream was a choked, soundless gasp. Her lungs refused to work. Flash! They were moving. Their hands were a blur. In the pulsing, nauseating light, they worked. Their arms pumped. Their hands flew. Their bodies rocked back and forth with a frantic, practiced rhythm. They were weaving, but the looms were silent. The thud, clack, clack of the shuttles. The roar of the machinery was absent. There was no thread. They were weaving the air, pantomiming their eternal labour in perfect, silent, horrifying unison. Darkness. The whispers rose again, but the words had changed. The plea had become a verdict, a celebration. She stayed. She's here. Sao Chuang. Stay with us. Flash. One of them was close, right in front of her. At her loom, line 3. It was a woman, or the memory of one. Her skin was the colour of bleached, damp, rotted linen. Her factory uniform was tattered, hanging from a frame that was little more than bone. She, too, was weaving the air, her hands a pale blur in the strobing light. Darkness. Leah tried to step back. She tripped over her own feet, falling hard against the metal casing of the adjacent machine. The cold of it bit through her jacket. Flash! The figure at line 3 stopped working. Its hands froze in mid-air. Slowly, with the dry, awful sound of cracking twigs, it turned its head. The strobing stopped. The failing light didn't die. It held. The emergency lamp settled into a steady, buzzing, green-yellow glow, the colour of sickness, casting the entire factory floor in a ghastly makasome underwater light. Leah could see her clearly. She could see her face. The figure's mouth was gone, in its place. The skin was puckered and pulled tight, grotesquely sewn shut with thick, black, industrial thread. The stitches were crude, wide and violent, digging deep into the pale flesh. The figure stared at Leah, its eyes. Oh God, the eyes. They were not eyes. They were holes. They were deep, cavernous, empty sockets, portals into a darkness so complete it seemed to drink the sickly green light from the air. There was no intelligence in them, only need, only hunger, an endless, patient, hollow stare that locked onto Leah and held her. A sound, a wet, muffled thump, came from the figure's chest, a single rotted hand. Its skin peeling from the bone, dropped from the loom. The woman with the sewn-shut mouth stood up. She was tall, impossibly tall, unfolding from the stool like a spider. She took one silent, gliding step away from the loom, towards Leah. Leah was paralyzed. The scream was a solid block of ice in her throat. She was pressed flat against the cold machine behind her, her muscles locked, her mind fractured into a million pieces of pure terror. She could not move. She could not breathe. She could not look away from the stitched-shut mouth and the endless, empty eyes. The figure raised its other hand. It was thin. The fingers yellowed like old ivory. Dangling from its fingertips, like a spider's silken web, were several long, dark strands. Black thread. The figure took another step. Its empty gaze fixed on her. It raised the thread. And the gesture was not a threat. It was an offering. It was a promise. It was coming to make her one of them. Leah's fingers, trembling and numb, pressed against the weeping plaster of the main weaving room. The dampness wasn't water. It was something else. Something thick and resinous that smelled of rust and age. She had been drawn here, past the silent, skeletal looms, to a section of the wall that seemed to buckle inward, as if holding its breath. The moment her skin made contact, the world did not fade. It was violently torn away. The vision slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Thud, clack, thud, clack, thud, clack. The sound was the first thing, a deafening, pounding rhythm of a dozen looms working at furious speed. But the air was wrong. It was not the cold, dead air of the ruin. It was a suffocating, searing heat. Acrid smoke clawed at her throat, stinging her eyes until they streamed. 1944, the date flashed behind her eyes, branded not as a number, but as a feeling of dread, of war, of desperation. The room was full of women. They were young, their hair tied back in simple and functional knots, their bodies clad in the dark, practical Montpe trousers of wartime. They were coughing, choking on the thickening smoke, but their hands did not stop. Thud, clack, thud, clack. Fire licked up the walls, catching on the hanging bolts of silk. The raw threads, usually vibrant, turned black and shriveled like burning nerves. A woman screamed, a high, thin sound that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the looms and the crackle of the inferno. Leah, a phantom observer, was dragged toward the main exit. A group of women was there, pounding on the heavy wooden doors. Their fists were bloody. They were screaming for help, for release. Then Leah saw it. A heavy industrial chain, thick with soot, looped through the handles and secured with a massive, cruel-looking padlock. They were locked in. They were trapped. The smoke was black now, oily, and thick with the smell of burning chemicals, burning silk, and something else, something sickeningly sweet and metallic, the smell of cooking flesh. The screams dissolved into wet, choked gasps, and still the looms pounded, thud, clack. One woman, her back already on fire, her hair a crown of flames, remained at her station. Her hands, charred to the bone, continued the motion, passed the shuttle, beat the reed, changed the heddle. Their screams were being choked back by a singular, impossible focus. They had to finish the weave. They were dying, but the work was not done. The commotion was stronger than the fire, stronger than the instinct to survive. It was a curse laid upon them, a duty enforced even as they burned. The vision fractured, the heat vanished, replaced by the tomb-like cold. Leah fell back, landing hard on the concrete floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was back in the present, in the dark, silent factory. She was hyperventilating, trying to scrub the phantom smell of burned hair from her nostrils. As she pushed herself up, her hand brushed against the wall she had touched. A piece of the rotten plaster, weakened by her psychic imprint, crumbled and fell away. A small dark cavity was revealed. From within, a shower of grey, flaky dust poured out, cascading over her hand. It was the ash from her earlier vision, and with it, Something small and metal clattered to the floor. She reached for it, her fingers clumsy. It was a small rectangular nameplate, the kind that might be affixed to a locker or a workstation. It was almost entirely consumed by rust. But 3 characters, etched deep, were still legible. Gao Chao Matsumoto, the name echoed in the cavern of her skull. It was a common name, but it was not common to her. It was the name that had defined her childhood stories, the name she shared in her very blood. It was her grandmother's surname. Obasan, she whispered. The word was a puff of white vapor in the cold. This wasn't a random haunting. This wasn't a local legend. This was her history. This was her bloodline. A sound made her freeze, a soft, wet tearing. The sewn-mouth woman was there, not across the room, not flickering in a corner. She was right in front of Leah, close enough to touch. The threads that sealed her lips were pulled agonizingly tight, the skin around them purple and swollen. The spirit raised one hand, her fingers thin and grey, and pointed, not at Leah, but at the pile of ash on the floor. From behind the stitches, a sound leaked out. It was not a voice, but the idea of a voice, a psychic whisper that bypassed her ears and drilled directly into her brain. Hai, Jup, help, us. Leah stared at the ash coating her hand. She looked at the crumbling walls, at the fine grey dust that coated every surface of the factory, that hung suspended in the beams of her flashlight. Her stomach lurched. A final, devastating realization clicked into place. The factory was not haunted. The ash was not from the fire. Not just from the fire. It was the pulverized, desecrated remains of the women who had died here. The dust in the air was their dust. The symbolic became literal. The factory was them. The walls had not been repaired. They had been filled. The owners, in a horrific act of desecration, had simply plastered over the evidence, mixing the ashes of the dead women into the very mortar used to seal the room. The building was not a factory. It was a mass grave, a vast, industrial urn. "Oh God," Leah breathed, scrambling backward. "You're in the walls! You are the walls!" The plea, "help us," had been a question, and Leah's revulsion was the wrong answer. The spirit's head snapped up. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly, extinguishing her flashlight and plunging the world into a suffocating, absolute darkness. The silence was shattered. Thud-clack, thud-clack, thud-clack. Every loom in the factory, dozens of them, slammed into motion at once. The sound was a physical assault, a deafening, unified roar that shook the very foundations of the building. It was the composite heartbeat of every soul trapped here, and it was furious. The single whisper of "help us" was gone, replaced by a multitude. A storm of overlapping, desperate, enraged cries filled her mind. "Let us out! Make them pay! You are one of us! Blood! Matsumoto! Blood! Stay! Weave! Help!" Leah turned and ran. She did not know where the exit was. She only knew she had to move. Hands, thin, grey, and coated in plaster, erupted from the walls. They were no longer phantoms. They were physical, grasping, tearing. One latched onto her ankle, its grip impossibly strong. She kicked, feeling dry. Brittle fingers snap, and scrambled forward on her hands and knees. The air became thick and choking, as if the ash in the walls was being exhaled into the room, a blizzard of human remains. She was breathing them in. Thud-clack, thud-clack. The sound was everywhere, inside her head, under her feet. The entire factory was now a single, churning machine of vengeance. She fled down the corridor, the one she had entered through, but it seemed wrong. The dimensions were stretching. The exit, a pale rectangle of moonlight far, far away, seemed to recede with every step she took. The sewn-mouth women were everywhere. They stepped out of the walls like swimmers emerging from water, their faces identical masks of agony, their stitched lips vibrating with their silent screams. They didn't chase her. They simply appeared in her path, forcing her to swerve, to double back, to lose her bearings in the labyrinth of their rage. She slammed her shoulder into a door, bursting through it into another section of the factory. The looms here were pounding too, weaving threads of shadow and dust. The spirits turned their heads in unison, their unseen eyes tracking her. She was not just a visitor, she was blood. They wanted her. They wanted to add her to their collective, to stitch her lips and put her to work. The Matsumoto bloodline owed them this. Weave with us. No, she screamed, the word tearing her own throat raw. She saw the main doors, the ones from the vision. They were chained, not in the present, but the spiritual weight of that 1944 chain held them fast. She knew she couldn't escape that way. She remembered a side door, a small, rusted maintenance exit she had passed on the way in. She dove through a forest of hanging, spectral threads, the new weave of the factory. They felt cold and sticky, like cobwebs made of sorrow. They clung to her, trying to tangle her, to slow her down. The thud clack was right behind her now. It wasn't just the looms, it was a sound, a presence, running down the hall after her. She reached the side door. It was rusted shut. She threw her entire weight against it. It didn't budge. The pounding from the hall stopped. A profound silence fell, heavier and more terrifying than the noise. Leah looked at the handle, her breath catching. A single, grey hand was resting on it from the other side. The door creaked open. She didn't pause to question it. She tumbled through the opening, falling 4 feet from the raised foundation onto the muddy, weed-choked ground outside. Leah landed hard, the impact knocking the last of the air from her lungs. She lay on her side, gasping, the mud and cold rain a shocking, welcome baptism. For a full minute, she just breathed, her entire body a single, agonizing tremor. The silence of the night was overwhelming. There were no looms. There was only the sound of the wind and her own ragged, desperate breaths. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her knees. She looked at her hands. They were caked in mud, but underneath, her palms were raw, blistered red as if she had pressed them against a hot stove, and they were stained black, not with dirt, but with the greasy, pervasive ash that had been inside. The smell was on her, in her hair, in her clothes, the smell of soot and old, burned fabric. The mental scar was deeper. The thud clack of the looms was still pounding in her skull, a new, permanent tinnitus of the soul. She would hear that sound in her sleep for the rest of her life. She would hear the impossible choice, burn to death or finish the weave. She had the truth. Her grandmother, her Obasan, had been part of this, a victim, a name on a rusted tag. Her body turned to mortar, the stories her grandmother used to tell, the ones Leah could barely remember. Were they attempts to warn her? Her fist was clamped shut, aching. She had been clutching something so tightly that her nails had drawn blood from her own palm. She forced her spasming fingers to open. There, sitting in the bloody, muddy, ash-stained center of her hand, was the nameplate, Gao Chao Matsumoto. It was the only thing she had taken. It was the physical proof. It was her scar. Leah staggered to her feet. She did not look back at the factory. She couldn't. To look at it would be to see 1,000 accusing, stitched-mouth faces staring back from the windows. The factory was not a building. It was a breathing mausoleum, a monument of calcified agony. She hadn't been an explorer. She had been an intruder. She hadn't solved the mystery. She had just confirmed the horror. She began to walk, then stumbled into a run, away from the looming silhouette. She was not victorious. She was not a survivor. She was just out. She had not escaped. She had only been released. The factory had let her go because she was blood. And now, clutching the nameplate that felt as heavy as a gravestone, she understood the true, terrible consequence. They didn't want to just keep her. They wanted her to finish the story. They wanted her to tell it. The escape from the factory was over, but the escape from the bloodline, that had only just begun. The rain was a physical assault, a cold, hammering percussion against the cracked windows of the foreman's office. Leah was no longer exploring. She was hiding. The factory, which had felt menacingly empty before, was now alive with a dreadful, coordinated industry. The air, thick with the metallic tang of rust and ozone, throbbed with the relentless, percussive thud-clack, thud-clack, thud-clack of the looms. It was a sound you felt in your teeth, a vibration that seemed to shake the very marrow of your bones. She had been running for what felt like hours, ducking behind skeletal machinery and slipping on floors slick with a slurry of rainwater and ancient grease. The shadows were no longer passive. They stretched and writhed, and from them, spectral figures moved with rigid, agonizing purpose. They weren't chasing her. They were working. They hauled phantom bolts of fabric, oiled invisible gears, and fed threads into the great skeletal machines that roared to a life only they could see. And the foreman was everywhere. The massive, smoke-darkened silhouette she had glimpsed before now patrolled the gangways, its form solidifying in the damp air. It didn't run, it simply was. One moment, it was at the far end of the weaving floor, its attention on a stalled, ghostly loom. The next, it was at the door of the very room she was in, its immense head turning, as if sniffing the air for the living, inefficient scent she carried. Leah had slammed the rotting office door and thrown her weight against it, her breath sobbing in her throat. The handle didn't rattle. A moment of silence stretched, broken only by the storm and the pounding looms. Then, a heavy, deliberate knock thudded against the wood, sending splinters dancing. It wasn't trying to break in. It was demanding she report for duty. She scrambled back, her pack catching on the leg of an overturned desk. She fell hard, her flashlight skittering across the floor and illuminating a mouldering pile of documents in the corner. It was her only light source, and it was now pointed directly at the factory's dark heart. This was the nexus. This was the origin. Shoving aside sodden, half-dissolved cardboard, she found it. A thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover warped and stiff as iron. It smelled of mildew and, dreadfully, of ash. With trembling, numb fingers, she pulled it open. The first few pages were meticulous. Production quotas, shipping manifests, names of workers. It was a textile factory, just as the records stated, but the dates, penned in a spidery, elegant script, were from 1943. As the pages turned, the entries grew more frantic. The ink bled, as if the writer was pressing too hard. The production numbers became impossible, astronomical. The lists of materials changed from cotton and wool to something simply listed as salvage and black dye. Then, a new section began. This one not in the neat hand of a clerk, but the desperate, slashing script of the foreman himself. Order 734, the military contract. They demand impossible numbers. The war is lost, but the shrouds are not yet woven. They pay in gold, but the cost is in souls. Leah's blood ran colder than the rain. This wasn't a civilian factory. It was a wartime production line, churning out military uniforms. She flipped a page, a brittle piece flaking away in her hand. The materials are gone. The workers are sick. I have locked the gates. The contract states production must not cease. They are coughing, the black lung, but the looms must run. A new, terrifying realization dawned. They weren't just employees. They were prisoners, trapped by a mad contract and a relentless foreman, forced to weave for a war that was already over for them. They whisper of sabotage, of fire. They are weak. They will not meet the quota. The contract is absolute. If they cannot fulfill it in life, they will fulfill it in death. The materials are low, but we have new thread. So much thread. Leah felt a physical sickness. The black threads, the ones she'd seen, the ones she'd touched. It wasn't just cotton. She turned to the final page. It was a single entry, dated over 70 years ago, on the night of the fire. The fire has started. They thought it would free them. Fools. It has only sealed the covenant. The looms are burning, but the The sound is forever. The factory protects its own. The factory claims its due. Order 734 is not complete. It will never be complete. We will work. We will always work. It all clicked into place, a horrifying mosaic of despair. The nameplate she'd found, it wasn't a relic. It was a job assignment. Her job assignment. The spectral figures, not haunting, but working. An eternal shift from which not even fire could release them. The sound of the looms, not a residual echo, but the ongoing, real-time sound of production in a place layered on top of her own reality. The overwhelming cold, the damp of the grave, the ash-choked air of a burned-out ruin, the unheated factory floor, the foreman, not a monster hunting her, but a manager, an enforcer, trying to get his new delinquent worker back to her station. The factory wasn't haunted by the dead, it was staffed by them, and it was hiring. The ledger slipped from her numb fingers. The thud, clack of the looms outside the door stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more terrifying than the noise. The storm itself seemed to hold its breath. The door handle turned. A slow, metallic shriek. The wood groaned and swung open on its one remaining hinge. The foreman stood there. It was impossible to see in the darkness of the hallway, yet it was perfectly defined. It was a void in the shape of a man, a colossal silhouette of compressed smoke, ash, and palpable rage. It radiated an arctic cold that burned her skin. Leah scrambled backward, pressing herself against the damp wall, her throat too tight to scream. She was trapped. She had learned the secret, and now she would join the production line. The entity stepped into the room, its presence sucking the very air from her lungs. It looked at her. It looked at the open ledger on the floor. It seemed to consider. Then, it did the last thing she ever expected. It stepped aside. The hallway, previously a maze of shadows and terrifying industry, was now clear. At the far end, she could see the main gates, stark against the grey, stormy sky. An exit, a hand, impossibly cold. Bante Bang Lang emerged from the smoke. It wasn't the foreman's, it was smaller, thinner, a woman's hand, slick with ashy water. It grabbed her by the arm, its grip like a manacle of ice. But it wasn't pulling her in. It was pushing her, guiding her. Leah stumbled, her legs refusing to obey. The ghostly hand shoved her harder, propelling her into the hall. She ran. She didn't look back. The foreman remained in the office doorway, a silent, monolithic sentinel. He wasn't letting her go. He was dismissing her. She burst through the rusted gates, collapsing onto the muddy gravel road outside. The gates swung shut behind her with a sound of final, booming finality. Troy Moore. The rain was real, cold, and clean. It washed the factory's grave stink from her skin. Im Lang that. The silence was beautiful, broken only by the wind and her own ragged gasps. She had survived. She was free. She was wrong. The drive home was a blur. She left her car and stumbled up to her apartment, locking and bolting the door, her entire body shaking in violent, uncontrollable tremors. She was safe. She was home. She stripped off her soaking clothes, throwing them in a pile by the door, and stood under a scalding shower until her skin was red, trying to wash away the feeling of that icy, wet grip on her arm. When she emerged wrapped in a towel, she froze, drip, drip, drip. On her clean, polished wooden coffee table sat the small, rusted nameplate she had found in the factory. K. Inoue. It was soaking wet. A small puddle of black, ashy water was spreading around it, staining the wood. Drip, drip, drip. It had beaten her home. Before she could even process the impossibility, a movement caught her eye. From the pile of her wet clothes, a single black thread slithered out, like a wet, dark worm. Then another, and another. They pulled themselves from the cuffs of her jeans, the seams of her jacket. They were the threads from the factory, her materials. They converged in the center of her floor, moving with a jerky, unnatural life. Soichi Dentu Kojiat, They began to weave. With horrifying speed and precision, the threads crossed and knotted, pulling taut, forming a pattern, a complex, repeating digital camouflage. Vthang Modet Kun Fuk, the pattern for the military uniforms, the pattern from the ledger. Her blood turned to ice. A new sound joined the rhythm of the rain outside. Thud clack, thud clack. It was quiet, but unmistakable. It was coming from her bedroom. No, it was coming from her phone, charging on the nightstand. She crept toward it, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had used it to record audio, hoping for EVPs. The audio file was playing, but it wasn't a recording. It was a transmission, the sound of the looms, loud, industrial, and impossibly clear, filled her apartment. The sound of the looms stopped. The threads on the floor went still. Silence. Then, from her phone's speaker, a new sound emerged. It was not the roar of the factory, but the sound of a single, dry, sibilant breath, whispered directly into a microphone. It was the foreman's voice, not a shout, but a cold, clear, managerial directive. Huan Tatdi, complete the order. The next morning, Leah sat on her couch, staring at the half-finished military pattern on her floor, the cold nameplate on her table. Her phone played nothing but static. She turned on the news. The top local story was a fire. A massive, unexplained inferno had erupted in the night, consuming the long-abandoned Dayanang textile mill. The structure, which had stood for 70 years, was now a smoking crater of blackened brick and twisted steel. The reporter interviewed a local elder, a man who had lived in the shadow of the factory his entire life. People always said that place was cursed, the old man said, his face grim against the backdrop of the smouldering ruins. They say the workers were never allowed to leave. Now, who knows? He looked directly into the camera, his eyes dark with a terrible, ancient knowledge. Ho, duk zai twat. Huak nyamai lay like fun quano. They were freed, or the factory reclaimed what was always its. On Leah's table, the nameplate was no longer wet. It was warm. Điện thoại phát âm thanh máy dẹt và một câu thì thầm. Hoàn tất đi. Ngày sau, nhà máy cháy thật, người địa phương bảo. Họ được giải thoát, hoặc nhà máy lấy lại phần của nó. So, what do you think? Is the factory truly haunted by the spirits of those who worked there, or is it something more mechanical and terrifying? An echo of an action, a procedure that simply never received the command to stop. This idea touches on a deep cultural concept found in many Asian spiritual beliefs, particularly Japanese Shinto and folklore. It's the idea of Zan-nen, kan-nian, which translates to a powerful, lingering regret or a profound sense of unfinished businesses. It's the belief that an overwhelmingly strong intention or a ritualistic daily action can leave an energetic imprint on a physical location, long after the people are gone. The haunting isn't a conscious soul, it's the procedure itself. Stuck on an endless, mindless loop, the factory's looms never stop weaving because the intent to work was embedded into its very walls. This same, chilling energy is waiting for us. We are leaving the factory, but this investigation is pulling us to a remote mountain hospital in Nagano, where they say the surgery in room 304 never finished, and the system loudspeaker is still calling for the doctor. I want to hear your theories. Comment below with what you believe is happening, and let me know where you're watching from. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories.